Hello, thanks again for joining us on the Nutrition, Health and Performance podcast. Really appreciate taking the time to download and to listen to this episode again. We're very lucky to have another fantastic guest. Today it's Dr. Patrick Wilson, someone that I've published some research with in the past, and we've written a couple of papers. We had one come out not too long ago looking at the effects of stress and anxiety on gut issues, something that I'm sure we'll touch on. So just to give you a quick rundown then, so Patrick is an associate professor of exercise science, and he also directs the Human Performance Lab at Old Dominion University. He earned his PhD in exercise physiology from the University of Minnesota and has completed postdoc training in sports nutrition at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He's authored over 45 scientific articles that span across disciplines such as sports science, sports nutrition and health. And something that we'll get into today, he's also the author of a recently released book, which is called The Athlete's Gut, The Inside Science of Digestion, Nutrition and Stomach Distress. Patrick's also an accredited registered dietitian through the Commission on Dietetic Registration. Patrick, I hope that's a good enough introduction. How are you doing today?
Yeah, that works well. I'm doing pretty well here in the States. Obviously, we're in a situation where many people are kind of stuck at home or spending a lot of time at home, but we're doing reasonably well given the circumstances.
Yeah, tough times. As I said, maybe we won't go into the politics and the details, things like that, but all good West stateside though.
Yeah, I mean, research activities and that sort of stuff are hard to do at the moment, so we've got online courses, so I'm spending a fair amount of time on that, working on some virtual research or online research, and we're spending a lot of time home with my son and wife, so that's a silver lining of obviously a tough situation.
Yeah, definitely. Let's just jump straight into it. So I mentioned the book there. So I suppose a good place to start would be if you could just give us a little bit of a background to yourself, and then maybe how did you get into this area of research to begin with?
Sure. So you kind of laid out a little bit about my educational credentials in the bio, so I'm not going to hit on that a whole lot. I guess my interest in gut issues and athletes probably started a couple of years into my graduate studies. So I've been, a recreational athlete throughout my life, runner, basketball, other athletic endeavors, and I've had kind of a keen interest in sport nutrition throughout my educational history. And when I was trying to figure out what to do for a dissertation project, I kind of gravitated toward something called multiple transportable carbohydrates, which I'm guessing some of your listeners are familiar with. Basically, the idea that if you're going to kind of crush carbohydrate during exercise, you're going to ingest a lot of it. There's this thought that if you use a mixture of glucose and fructose, you get a better absorption efficiency, less GI distress, and the like. So a lot of the studies had shown that to be helpful for cyclists, but for runners, it's a little bit harder to consume large amounts of food and fluid during running itself. So I wanted to see actually if that strategy applied to runners as well. Because for them, it's a little bit harder to consume more than 50, 60 grams of carb per hour. Most runners probably naturally decide to consume 400, 500, 600 milliliters of fluid and maybe 30 to 45 grams of carb per hour if you'd kind of let them naturally pick what they would want to do. So my dissertation study that was focused in the lab looked at feeding different beverages, one with all glucose, the other with a mixture of glucose and fructose, to see whether that had any impact on performance, but also GI symptoms during running bouts that lasted about 2.5 hours. So that was kind of the starting point. And then from there, it's hard to remember, honestly, how I gravitated into doing some more gut-related projects. It just kind of happened. And progressively, more of my research started to be focused on that. So a couple of years ago, I thought about writing a book, and I figured part of it would cover gut issues. But as I started to look around, I saw that there were a lot of sport nutrition books already and no books on exclusively the gut and athlete. So that's kind of what I decided to do. It took me about 1.5 years to write it. And then shopped it around to some publishers, and ultimately Velo Press in Colorado in the United States decided to put it out, and it basically came out this past month in the U.S. and is being released, I think, like in the U.K. and internationally at the end of May here.
Yeah, it's as you said, it's interesting there hasn't been a book to date, because when you speak to runners, especially that a lot of that is a lot of my background is in that area. You talk to runners, and it's something that to some degree at some point most runners will have experienced some sort of issue, and then when you open that out and you look across sport, even if it's not as prevalent, there are still some of these really high profile incidents that you can highlight with gut issues.
Yeah, the study that I did a few years ago where I asked about 150 runners to track their GI symptoms for a full month, which is kind of unique in that most studies either look at things just at one point in time or they retrospectively ask runners about their problems. So as far as I'm aware, this is one of the only studies that kind of did it prospectively for any amount of time. And what you kind of saw in the results of that study was that on any given run, most runners were not experiencing major problems. But if you look over the entire month, a pretty high percentage of them ended up experiencing substantial issues. And to define, I guess, substantial issue, I would say it's a 5 or more on a 0 to 10 scale for things like nausea, bloating, fullness, cramping, urges to go number 2, that sort of stuff. So yeah, at some point, most runners especially are going to deal with moderate to severe GI symptoms over a couple month period. And there's lots of anecdotes, case histories of high profile athletes kind of experiencing those sorts of things. Going back as far as the first Tour de France in 1903, the French cyclist Hippolyte Couturier was one of the favorites supposedly to win the entire tour, and he had to drop out at the first stage a few hundred kilometers into it, supposedly because of severe stomach cramps. It's hard to say exactly why he was experiencing that issue. I mean, it could be all sorts of stuff, but he basically was disqualified from winning the entire tour because if you drop out at any given stage, even if you win subsequent stages, you can't win the overall race. Other more contemporary examples would be like Paula Radcliffe in 2005 during the London Marathon, probably had one of the most public instances of GI distress. She was winning the race. I think it was around mile 22 or so. You kind of see her swerve over to the crowd barrier, squat down, kind of pull her shorts aside, and proceed to go to the bathroom. I mean, it looks like she's peeing, but in interviews, she basically says she was having stomach issues, a lot of pain. She couldn't really find a porta potty, and by the time she saw one, she wasn't going to jump over a crowd barrier to get there. So she thought if she just went quickly and got it over with, it would be the best thing to do. I mean, she ended up winning the race, so it didn't, ultimately kill her performance, but probably one of the more publicly embarrassing GI issues that an athlete has experienced, in front of thousands of TV viewers and then spectators at the event. One of the more, I think, recent is Tom Dumoulin from the Giro d'Italia in 2017. There was a stage where he basically swerved over to the side of the road, scampered down this grassy embankment, and dropped down his shorts to go to the bathroom. And the commentators weren't really sure what he was doing at first until they finally saw him pull down his garments and were like, okay, time to cut the cameras away. So obviously he had a very high profile incident with that. I mean, there's many cases of this stuff happening. I mean, you can Google images of athletes in GI distress and see some disturbing things.
There is. I was going to say there are some unbelievable images online. If you do look, there is one of the most recent ones as well, and commitment to the cause. I want to get this as right as I get. I'm sure it was the Japanese men's marathon championships, and essentially I can't remember if they were winning or if they were in a podium place, but the runner just proceeds to go to the toilet as he runs, and you can just. If you see the images, you'll see it. It's all over the place, and because he didn't feel like he even had the time to stop. And as I said, it's just that you see these cases, and obviously the big international races get highlighted. And it's, as you said, you have that range then of Paula, who, you know, luckily she still won. And then you look at other competitions. I think about the Rio Olympics, and there was the race walker from France, who medal position ends up, you know, I think 6th or something like that. And, you know, severe issues, not just symptoms, but I think gets, you know, taken to hospital and gets medical treatment. So you, as you said, you have these range of issues all throughout sport, and they highlight it. And that's why I was quite surprised that you haven't seen a book really published in this area. And a bit like you said, and it's similar for me, you start in one area specifically in your research, looking at the carbohydrate use and the multiple transporters. You're, as a side measure, you're looking to see the effects of symptoms. And then as you sort of delve into that, you realize that all of these different symptoms happening so infrequently, and then to try and work out, well, why do you sometimes get issues on particular runs or particular training sessions? Why do some people seem to suffer more than other athletes as well?
Yeah, I was pretty surprised when I looked around at, you know, to see if there were other books on the topic. And of course, there are some that have a chapter or two devoted to it. But given how prevalent those issues are, especially in endurance athletes, you know, I was pretty surprised that there wasn't really another book out there. And I thought, well, if I don't do this in the next couple of years, somebody's gonna. So this is kind of the time to do it. I think I was fortunate in terms of the timing when I decided to start writing a book, that there really hasn't been at least a comprehensive resource there for athletes, geared towards athletes and for practitioners.
Yeah, definitely. I saw you talk about the book the other week on an online webinar, and one of the things that you've mentioned in there is the breakdown of, and this is what I found when I started doing research in this area, is that often, and I suppose that as we've done here now, you talk about gut issues or GI complaints, and we sort of bundle, or people bundle everything together, when actually some of these can be completely separate issues, and to group them actually means that you're less likely to find the cause behind it. And I think the way you've gone into the book to talk about this is really good.
Yeah, so the second chapter of the book basically kind of goes through each possible symptom you could experience and tries to explain some of the possibilities, because as you're alluding to and talking about there, sometimes the symptoms arise for the same reason, or it has the same mechanism, but in many cases the mechanisms are different. I mean, like most exercise scientists or people who have any education in exercise science know that reductions in gut blood flow, for example, can make most symptoms worse. Similarly, exercising the heat can also do that. But then there's other sort of culprits that are more symptom specific. So, a good parallel or example would be, comparing nausea and something like gas or bloating. I mean, nausea has a lot of different possibilities, but one of them would be, for example, with high intensity exercise like repeated sprinting or something like that, you get a really large release of catecholamines, adrenaline, that sort of stuff, that in large amounts can act on the brain to trigger what's called the vomiting center. And there's good evidence that it's actually in part because of these catecholamines. And some of that evidence comes from, studies that use epinephrine as a medical treatment. Or my favorite probably is a case series of, it was like 8 or 9 people with these growths or tumors that cause hypersecretion of these catecholamines. And they oftentimes experience exercise-associated nausea. And removing those growths or tumors can oftentimes help reduce that problem. So I think there's pretty strong evidence that catecholamines are playing at least some role, especially with high-intensity exercise. Now, comparing that to like bloating and gas, we generally would acknowledge that for those symptoms, it has to do with gas production. And the amount of catecholamines you have circulating in your blood probably aren't a major factor. So when it comes to gas and bloating, it might be too much fiber, too many fermentable carbohydrates in your diet would be what you'd want to take a look at to deal with that particular type of symptom. There's probably 10 symptoms I go through, or 10 sort of signs I go through in the book. And sometimes the causes are similar, but in many cases they're quite different. So I think that's something that practitioners and athletes should be aware of, is if they're trying to reduce gut issues, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach that works for every situation. And you need to document the specific symptoms you're experiencing to hopefully get a better understanding of what's causing those issues, and then how you can go about addressing them in a symptom-specific manner.
No, definitely. And as you said there, with some of these symptoms, I think you're also then more likely to see certain athletes experience, one symptom over the other, or some symptoms more than others. As you said, with the symptoms of nausea, with very high intensity exercise, anyone who's done a flat out 400 meter run around a track, or a Wingate test in the lab, just 1 30-second sprint, you will know the feeling of wanting to throw up, of just feeling very sick. But if we just look at that one then particularly, because it's just, as I'm thinking now, is that inevitable for most people then, or are there potential strategies around that they could look to use?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in some cases, some level of GI symptoms or nausea in that example is inevitable. I mean, you can also look at ultra endurance exercise. For 100-mile races, the prevalence of nausea can be 60%. And that's not to say that everybody has severe nausea, but 60% may have some level. To me, that suggests that there's some inevitability to some people having those problems. But I do think there are some strategies that almost in every situation people can take to at least reduce the severity. So, as an example, like for the ultra runner who is having reoccurring problems with nausea, you'd want to, again, take a look at their circumstances surrounding those issues, whether it be the environmental conditions, what you ate before, during the race, are you overly anxious or stressed before, during the race, and get a sense of what are the most likely things that are contributing. And based on that, you can tailor your interventions to hopefully at least reduce the severity, or maybe delay how long it takes. So instead of having nausea 50 miles into the race, maybe it takes 70 miles into the race, which is an improvement nonetheless. So it might be, if you're an athlete who suffers from a lot of pre-race anxiety, using deep breathing or mindfulness or those types of approaches to at least reduce the stress response that occurs pre-race, to hopefully get a little bit better handle on those issues that develop during the race. I mean, then there's other stuff like taking supplements or even prescription drugs, ondansetron, Zofran, I think is the brand name, that, they're on hand at ultra endurance races. If you continually have problems with nausea, you could always speak to your physician about using something like that in an attempt to help at least mitigate the severity that you're experiencing during a race itself.
Yeah, because I think there's two parts that definitely, I know we all want to be as competitive as we can, but for some people, they want to enjoy the race as much as possible, especially like an ultra marathon. It can be a huge achievement just to finish, and so it might just be that you want to complete it with as little distress as possible. And I think sometimes maybe as much as you want to limit it at the top end, and the sharp end of the field, as you said, it might just be delaying the onset or reducing the severity as best we can. But one of the things that I wanted to just go back to slightly a little bit, I've just written down, and it's one of the reasons why you first came onto my radar, I suppose, is that a lot of what you're talking about there, yes, there is that diet component to it, and people will jump onto the diet straight away because you're talking about the intestinal, the gastrointestinal system, so it's synonymous with digestion and food. But there are all of these other factors that are important anyway. And I think this is where a lot of research, I know it's tough because we make these incremental improvements in knowledge, but I think a lot of the areas we need to go, and then as an athlete or a coach, you need to think about, is how all of these things interact a little bit. Like, so you're saying there about pre-race stress or anxiety. You would want to address that anyway, regardless. I would argue, even if not just because of the potential gut issues, but because of other impacts it can have on your performance. But I think what your work's done is really highlight that these things can still affect it, though. And so it's not just a case of, well, change what you eat the day before, because if you then, or change what you eat during the race, because if you have poor sleep, you have high levels of anxiety, all of these things could be that you're undoing anyway in the race.
Yeah, the issue with, I think, gut symptoms is you're kind of getting at there is many times it's multifactorial in terms of what's causing these issues. It's, at least in my experience, it's rare that it's always just one thing. I mean, there are some situations where, yes, it is one thing where, you crush way too much fettuccine Alfredo before, your race or something like that, a la Michael Scott from The Office. Or, you ingested way too much hypertonic fluid during your race or something like that. But oftentimes it's an interaction of factors that leads to these problems. So it could be chronic lack of sleep plus pre-race anxiety plus poor nutritional choices that really is a major factor in some people's experiences with these symptoms. And I think that actually plays out in the research, because if you look at studies, observational studies that try and predict who's going to experience these problems, the correlation with any single factor is never very big. I mean, most of the correlations you see are like a 0.2, 0.3, which is a pretty small association, right? For non-scientists who are listening, 0 is basically no correlation, 1 is a perfect correlation, and we're kind of on the lower end of the spectrum of a 0.3, 0.2 for things like exercise intensity or experience or age or stress or anxiety. So to me, that's suggesting that in most cases, these issues are explained by a multitude of variables as opposed to just one thing. And that's kind of what I try and address in the book, is that there's a lot of possibilities. You're probably not going to completely 100% prevent every case of GI upset during training or competition. The best hope for most people is to reduce the severity or reduce the occurrence. By no means do I try and convince people that this is a easy fix in most cases. And in a lot of situations, it requires some trial and error and maybe multiple interventions to really get some good relief.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's important for a lot of people to remember. I remember when we had the marathon study published a couple of years ago now with the probiotics, and you do a couple of interviews and things like that. And as I said, we showed in that study that in a group of marathon runners during a race, the severity scores of gut symptoms in the probiotic group were lower than a group that took a placebo. And naturally then, as I said, whether it be a journalist or just people that get in touch with you, they think that you found this cure-all and that it's this simple strategy. Okay, well, if I take the probiotic, and I always point out that if you look at the data, the ones in the probiotic group still had symptoms, still had moderate symptoms as well. So it's not even like we took them from severe to negligible. Some of them still reported symptoms that affected performance. And as you said, all of this, you can look at it and you might change one part of your diet, but it's not to say that you will or won't have an improvement. And from our point of view, to study this then, as you said, is so difficult because you just need these big numbers. We've tried to do a couple of studies in the lab where we might look at the effect of, as you've already pointed out, fermentable carbohydrates or large amount of carbohydrate drinks that runners might take on during exercise. But as we've already pointed out, every runner doesn't get a symptom on every single training run. So if you get the participants into a lab, your likelihood of anyone developing a symptom on the treadmill or on the exercise bike is quite small anyway.
Yeah, and then sometimes the interventions that you have to use because of that fact is you create these interventions that are somewhat artificial, that induce more GI distress than what is probably normal in most cases. So, going back to the multiple transportable carbohydrate research, one, I guess, maybe criticism of that area is that, yes, the glucose fructose beverages seem to work better than all glucose beverages. But in most of these studies, you're feeding people very, very aggressive rates of carbohydrate that the vast majority of athletes do not ever decide to do on their own. So you're looking at 60 to 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour. And yes, if you ingest a mixture of glucose and fructose at that rate, it leads to less GI symptoms. But the people getting the glucose fructose still have a fair amount of GI symptoms just because you're feeding them so much. So there's a question of whether or not that approach is better than just taking a more moderate carbohydrate ingestion rate of something like 30 to 60 grams per hour. So you're right. I mean, long story short, it's complicated and it can be difficult to study in a lab setting because, as you're smartly pointing out, the incidence of severe or substantial GI distress during any given run is pretty low in most cases. So either you need a bigger sample, or sometimes you have to, use some sort of intervention that artificially inflates, the typical prevalence of GI issues. Another example might be the FODMAP studies, where they give people a really high FODMAP diet compared to a low FODMAP diet, and they show a reduction in symptoms. But that's, keeping in mind that the control or the comparison was a really high FODMAP diet that only a relatively small number of athletes would probably be following on their own. So, yeah, it's a challenging area to do research in, just because the incidence of these issues on any given run or competition is really, low.
I think that's where some of the mass participation races or these observational studies then can be quite useful, because you do get these. It's maybe a bit less well controlled, but you get these big numbers, and you can start to look at some of these factors in greater number and have that bigger likelihood of symptoms. In terms of other strategies, then, so we mentioned some of the things that go back to you touched on supplements. Are there supplements with reasonable, good evidence to reduce some of these symptoms?
Yeah, I think it depends on the athlete, depends on the situation, obviously. So in the book, I don't really prescribe supplements or anything like that, but I do try and provide, some objective evaluation of the evidence, and then say if you're going to use these things based on your own decision-making process, these are the things you should consider. So, obviously probiotics are a thing to take a look at. And, my personal evaluation of the research is that it's kind of mixed. When it comes to at least GI symptoms, I think, there's pretty good evidence that they reduce the risk of upper respiratory tract infections, that they may help deal with things like IBS in some athletes, reduce severity of diarrhea from antibiotic use. So if you have an athlete who's, using an antibiotic for whatever reason. But with GI symptoms, it's tricky because, again, all these symptoms are a little bit different. So a probiotic theoretically could reduce something like constipation or loose stools, but at the same time could increase the incidence of flatulence or even mild bloating. So it's tricky because it depends on the strain, depends on the dosage, depends on the individual athlete. So it becomes a little bit difficult to give recommendations for probiotics when it comes to GI symptoms specifically.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Probiotics especially is so difficult. I was on the Fuel the Pedal podcast to give a shout to Gabrielle there. We released that episode last week, and what was going to be just a small talk about probiotics, I think we ended up talking for about an hour and a half, and so much of it came down to exactly what you're pointing out there. The strains, the supplements are so different that it would not exactly, but it would sort of be akin to going to tell someone, okay, you need to go and take a vitamin. Where it's so specific to the probiotic you're looking at, but unfortunately then you get all these reviews that bundle everything together, and it makes it quite tough to look at.
And I don't think there's a huge amount of risk to taking probiotics. So if you think there's some rationale for an individual athlete to take it on their own, I don't think there's a huge amount of risk for most of them. I personally take a probiotic, but that doesn't mean that I think everybody should, and I'm even somewhat skeptical that I get a benefit from it. But that's true of most supplements in my mind, is that I may decide to take something, but I'm even fairly skeptical when I'm taking something that it's providing a large benefit. It's hard to tell in any given person whether a supplement is actually doing a whole lot.
That there is the challenge I pose to everyone, in that if you were to stop taking this supplement, could you measure a detriment in health or illness or anything like that? Could you measure it? And as you said, I'm the same. I'm so skeptical on most supplements.
Yeah.
Especially when you're handing over your money for it. I think would I rather, I don't know, this supplement for a month, or would I rather go and get a sports massage or a physio session or something?
Most people want to believe in it if they're going to spend time or money on it. So there's obviously kind of a positive response bias. I mean, I think maybe the one supplement that I've noticed that I've taken in the past that has done something for me that I'm more subjectively convinced was doing something was creatine. I mean, I noticed lifting a little bit more in the gym, but clearly that could be a positive response bias on my own thinking. But I think most supplements, the benefits are kind of marginal. So in any given person, it's almost next to impossible in some cases to tell exactly what it's doing. So that's why we do scientific studies to see with a larger group of people what's the average response. And in most cases, the responses aren't huge. So it makes it difficult to tease that out in any single person.
But all of that ties in nicely to what we're talking about here with the GI response. You see it particularly in IBS studies. If you supplement with, no matter what the supplement is, but it's supplement X versus placebo, you tend to see improvements in both groups. So
I think IBS is one that's definitely true. Yeah.
So as you say, so when you're then prescribing to athletes, if there is a genuine belief that it reduced the issue of GI symptoms, it probably will, just from that strong placebo effect. And it is such a psychosomatic area. So you said it's your perception of the discomfort or the pain, and if you've taken something that you think, okay, well, this will dampen that, there's a good likelihood it will.
As a practitioner or someone who's working with an athlete when they do that stuff, it's hard to talk to them about that too, because if you say, hey, your improvements could be sort of a placebo effect, or we don't necessarily know how much of it is the actual probiotic or whatever supplement versus maybe this is just the natural course of the disease or condition or whatever symptoms you're experiencing, because those symptoms kind of wax and wane over time for most people. It's kind of a super hard challenge to figure out, for individual athletes, exactly what some of these interventions are doing. And that's probably true of a lot of things, not even just nutrition. It's, training and other lifestyle things. I'm not saying don't do those things or they're not worthwhile. It's just sometimes hard to objectively document what the effects are in any given person.
100%, and I definitely see it when I work with athletes, and even when I do it with coaches, in that you see some people with strong beliefs, strong opinions in you should do this and this will produce this result, and I always sit on the fence on a lot of things. I'm like, well, I don't know, you could take this much or this much, and because I'm not 100% sure which would be better, and that's where, as he says, practitioner, it can be tough, and especially the more you look into the research, the more you see the ambiguity there.
I think it's different worlds, right? Researchers, practitioners. As a researcher, you're trained to kind of be skeptical and take a view that these things are complicated and there's rarely clear answers. And then, as a practitioner, I completely understand that that's not what most people are attracted to in terms of clients or athletes. They don't want to be told that maybe this will work, maybe it won't. I mean, I think naturally humans gravitate towards clarity, and so it's a tough position for practitioners to be in, for sure, is to try and remain objective, but also try and convince people that you know what you're talking about. Because sometimes they just think, well, if you're not giving me a straight answer, then you don't know what you're talking about. That's not necessarily the case. So I don't envy practitioners' jobs in many cases, because it's really difficult to talk to athletes about these things and make sense of what the research says.
And that's where then, as you said, getting the buy-in will be great, and that's where we come back to it. Books like yours will be useful in that you can start to see, well, actually, we can try this. If it doesn't work, it's not to say that we won't find the answer, but we just need to keep looking a little bit. And I think that's, we normally try and come up with some nice, easy, usable takeaways, and I think of this, it's not just to try and sell the book for you, but I think it's not as simple as that with some of the things we're discussing here. So I think one of the questions I would put to you, though, is what research or what information would you have liked to be available that could have gone into the book? Maybe some of the unknowns or something.
Yeah, I think there's a couple areas. One is the microbiome. Yeah. And I don't talk a huge amount about the details of the microbiome. I definitely mention it, and I do talk about it with respect to kind of the bacterial counts in your large intestine, some of the effects it has on health. But the research is so early in that area that I feel like it's a little too preliminary to make any sort of strong conclusions about what it means to athlete performance and health. I mean, there's all sorts of studies linking the microbiome to various health conditions. There's now probably maybe a dozen studies that have done this in athletes, tying it to things like cardiorespiratory fitness or other measures of performance. There's even that rat study or mouse study, I don't remember which one it was, that did basically a intervention where they, I think it was Veillonella bacteria that they pretty much deposited into these mice gastrointestinal tracts and saw improved performance on a running wheel. People are making a big deal of that. But to me, it's just way, way too early to have any sort of prescription about what you should be eating or what supplements you should be taking to alter your microbiome, to enhance performance or training. I just think it is too early in the game to make any sort of concrete prescriptions about that. So that was one that I wish I had more information to go on. There just wasn't enough, I thought, that was practical for athletes to use. So hence, there's not a huge amount of detail on that. What's your thought on that area?
Absolutely, exactly the same. I was going to jump in and say in that I think we're at the stage where even in microbiome research, as a whole discipline, so beyond just sport and exercise, I think it's in its infancy still, even though it's been looked at and researched for a long time. I think for sport and exercise and performance, I think we're only at the point where we can say, yeah, this is cool and it could impact athletes directly or indirectly, which I think, yes, we can all agree on now. The how and the why and the manipulation of and all of that, I think, is a very long way off.
Yeah, so if there's no practical recommendations you can give, I was hesitant to put a bunch of, let's say, 10, 20 pages in the book on the microbiome, and then at the end say, well, we don't really know what to do with this information. So I was hesitant to do that, and that's why there's not really a large section on that in the book. Although, I think most people, when they buy it or they see it, they would expect there to be more, and that's the reason there isn't, to be honest, is specifically for athletes. And this is even probably true for a lot of more general health outcomes in medical conditions, is that there's still a lot of unknowns in terms of how you actually use that information practically. I'm a little bit skeptical that there's going to be a set of clear recommendations with the microbiome because it seems to be such a complicated area. But that's just a guess on my part because I don't actually study the microbiome. I'm not a microbiologist. So, I'm hesitant to make any sort of prediction about what's going to happen with that.
Yeah, I agree, though. And as I said, I think it's not... I think it's smart to hedge your bets that way because I always explain it the same way to people. You're not talking about, you're not talking about a simple organ. You're talking about an entire ecosystem, and you've only got to, everyone remembers watching a cartoon as a kid where they go and put a new animal in the rainforest and all hell breaks loose.
Yeah,
it's the exact same thing. You're not just making one minor tweak, you might be changing an entire ecosystem, and you can't predict what direction those changes will go completely. So I agree. I think it's something that's interesting, but practical recommendations are way off if they'll even ever come.
Yeah. So that was one area for sure. I mean, there's some other stuff. I mean, we've obviously done some research together with the psychological aspect, and there's a third of the book devoted to that, but there aren't actually intervention studies showing how to best apply some of those principles to mitigate GI issues. So it would be nice if there was more data to go on there. I mean, it's even surprising how little research there is on reducing competition anxiety to improve performance. I mean, there's shockingly little research in that area. So There's definitely a section of the book that I talk a lot about that stuff, but it's kind of a bit of an extrapolation from other populations and saying that this may or may not help you. It's worth a shot in a lot of cases. There's probably a little risk to some of these interventions, but it was a bit of a guessing game in some ways, or predictions that I was making based off of limited research in other populations.
No, that's fantastic. And then just remind us again, I know you touched on the start, so the book is out and available now in the US?
Yeah, and I think the release in the UK and most of the major online distributors that I've seen is May 28th is what they're saying. There's always, I think, some variability depending on when each of them get their shipments in. That was kind of the same case in the US. It was kind of released over a few week period at different publishers or different distributors. So yeah, sometime in late May. The ebook is supposed to be coming out this month. So that's probably another option for readers. The dates are probably going to vary on that. But I think most people in the UK and then internationally should have some sort of purchasing option here by late May or so to be able to get a copy of the book if they're interested.
Perfect. And they said all of the usual suspects there online where they'll be able to find it. And then where's the best place for people to reach out or get in touch with you or just keep track of some of your work and stuff like that?
Yeah, they can follow me on Twitter. That's probably the main sort of social media place that I post stuff related to research and whatnot. So that's at sportsrd_PhD.
Perfect. And listen, thank you so much again, Patrick, for coming on and having this chat with us. I think it'll be really interesting for a lot of people. I think that even if they haven't found the answer, it'll definitely send them down the rabbit hole a little bit. Yeah,
thanks for inviting me on, Jamie. It's always fun to talk about this stuff.
Perfect. Enjoy the rest of the day, and I'll speak to you soon.
Yep, sounds good.